Hi! I watched the PBS documentary titled The Released, which discussed deinstitutionalization and the transition that prisoners who suffer from mental illness must go through when they are released from prison back into real life and society. I think through this documentary I realized how hard of a transition that is for prisoners who suffer from mental illness, and how the impact of community-based care can have on prisoners who suffer from mental illness. For me, I tend to think of prisoners as men or women who are sentenced in prison for however long due to their crime, and then once they're released, we tend to forget about them. Or we focus on them so much because we're waiting for them to commit another crime. But in reality, what happens to the prisoners who suffer from mental illness? Do they go find a job and get a home and are financially stable? Or are they homeless? Or are they on medications and then stop taking them and then end up committing more crimes and back in prison again? And I think this documentary really helped me gain perspective on what's happening in society right now. Deinstitutionalization, I think, was a good policy in the beginning. It just went too far, in a way. And that's what a man at the end of the documentary had mentioned. I think deinstitutionalization was needed because the conditions in the institutions were so horrible for the patients. Yet there should have been a more thought-out plan when all of them were released, instead of just releasing all of them and expecting them to fend for themselves and provide for themselves. Human services and community-based care would have a huge impact on those patients if that's what they would have received when they were released. Yet most of them just were freed, but then they had nowhere to go, nowhere to turn to. So in the case of this documentary, it discussed how mentally ill patients often committed crimes due to their mental state. And in the case of the documentary, all of the men were schizophrenic and had some psychotic episodes or paranoia, and that they believed they were hearing voices, and that's often why they had committed these crimes. I want to highlight Lynn's story and Benny's story. And first, in Lynn's story, he ended up in prison first by breaking an entry in a woman's home because he was looking for Osama bin Laden, or believed that he was going to find him there or something, and was in prison for a little bit. Then he was released on parole, which was actually used to help prisoners get involved in their community instead of just leaving them to fend for themselves and forgetting about them. Lynn ended up staying in a shelter with a bunch of other men who were either prisoners, mentally ill, or financially unstable. He found it very difficult to transition from prison life to real life. He struggled with drug abuse and really attempted to stay clean, but realized that he needed the support and aid from others, and he couldn't do it on his own. He ended up beginning to meet with case managers and wanted to start looking for work. And I noticed how the case manager in the documentary set goals and objectives for Lynn. I believe this is very impactful in human services within the human service model, if we're looking back at chapter 4 of the textbook, because it highlights how human services helps clients solve their problems rather than just saying, here's help, we're gonna help you do this, but you don't have to do anything. Instead, human services is, here's the help, but you're gonna have to put some effort into it. You're gonna have to help us help you, and teach that self-sufficiency so that once they no longer receive help from human services, they can function and continue living on their own. In Lynn's case, the case manager helped him set goals maybe by like applying for 1 to 2 jobs a week. And that was something Lynn could add to the therapy or, meeting with the case manager. He felt like he was doing something, putting in some effort and some part so that it wasn't just all of the case manager. In Benny's story, he suffered a lot with paranoia, and when he stopped taking his medications, that's when he began to commit crimes again. And this is the case, I think, in all of the men in the documentary. Once they stopped taking their medications, that's when they began to commit crimes again. They were in prison, and then once they were released from prison, they were doing well when they were in group homes, in Lynn's case, and then also in Benny's case. He also found a room in a group home, and was forced to see a psychiatrist once every 2 weeks. In Benny and Lynn's case, when they were seeing psychiatrists, case managers, in group homes, receiving help and support from others, that's when they were fine. That's when they weren't committing crimes, when they weren't having trouble with their mental illnesses. They were doing great. But it was when they stopped taking their meds or they weren't in that support group or that community that they ended up in prison again, and the cycle started all over. It really saddened me to see at the end how Benny disappeared and then was in jail again, and then Lynn was released and then arrested again. And I think for me, a successful release from prison would be released, but then make sure that they have support from a human service professional in some way to help them get back up on their feet and not just leave them to do everything on their own, because it is hard, and I never realized that for prisoners, and especially those who suffer from mental illness, that if they don't have someone there to tell them to take their medications or help them find a job or help provide with housing and just daily needs, they won't be able to survive in a way. Looking back at the textbook, I think wraparound services, which is kind of a part of community-based care, really helps prisoners adjust back to real life because it teaches them coping skills, problem-solving skills, and that self-sufficiency, where they can really learn how to cope with issues, stress, their mental illness. They can learn how to solve problems in life, and then they can also learn how to provide and help themselves by being self-sufficient. I think also having that care from a human service professional in the beginning is also important because it helps the prisoners advocate instead of them having to advocate just for themselves and having no one else there to help them support themselves is really important, because sometimes they need just that first push or even an extra push to get them going, and then they'll be fine. This documentary also showed the different models that were mentioned in Chapter 4. The medical model, seen through how all of the men were on medication, but then when they stopped taking their medication, that's when everything fell apart again. Also the public health model, because it was looking at the population of prisoners with mental illness as a whole and how, as a society, we can help that whole population instead of just pinpointing all of the individuals, but helping them as a whole by maybe providing an overall human service program that they can go through or use once they are released. And then lastly, human services, which, like I mentioned earlier, focuses on solving the problems in the clients and helping them learn how to provide for themselves and live on their own once they're released. Thank you.